There we go. Hello and welcome to the Practice as Research seminar series. My name is Nicole Brown and I'm really delighted to have you all here today for another exciting seminar. I have got the privilege to know what's coming because obviously I have invited today's speaker. And I have seen her do a presentation a few months ago, and that was one of the opportunities where I thought to myself, let's see if I can get her to present at this particular Practice as Research series. So today I have got with us Lucy Harding, who is going to be talking about entanglements, practice as research, and thinking with in prison education research. As always, I apologize. As always, these seminars are, an opportunity to kind of share experiences from different disciplines. And it's really exciting for me to have somebody here who's not only doing prison research, but who's actually teaching in an interesting place as well, the Royal College of Physicians. So I'm going to introduce Lucy briefly. Lucy holds the position of Senior Educationalist at the Royal College of Physicians, and she's at the same time pursuing her doctoral studies at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. With a career in education for over 2 decades, she initially specialised in creative disciplines such as textiles and fashion. Her professional journey led her to be a programme leader of teacher education, followed by an educational management role in a male prison. And this is where I felt like, Lucy's career trajectory, kind of, connected with me or resonated with me simply because, there's all these disciplinary, conventions and norms that you have to navigate as you come from one area of education into a different one. So that was something that I found particularly exciting. Working within the confines of prison environments has profoundly influenced Lucy's perspective of challenging teaching in the periphery of the education sector. And this is where her work comes in that she's going to present on today. Her research focus centres on understanding the affective experiences of teachers working in demanding and often traumatic settings. In her research methodology, she employs innovative approaches incorporating creative elements such as drawing, weaving and stitch work as integral components of data collection and post-qualitative inquiry. This unique approach allows her to perceive phenomena in a new and different way. And here we go. With that, I'm going to hand over to Lucy. As I said, Lucy, I'm keeping myself muted, but I'm here and I will keep an eye on the chat function. So there we go. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'll just share my screen. Okay. There we go. So, I've a different title here, and the reason for that is because this is quite often how I feel about practice-based research, but also about my creative methodologies. So quite often when I'm working with these creative methodologies, with stitch, with drawing, I will pause and repeat this phrase to myself and think, why the F have I done this? Because it's not the easy route. And those of you on the call who have perhaps dabbled in different creative methodologies may have felt the same as well. It certainly isn't the easy option. So Nicole's already given you a little bit about me. I think it's really important to also recognise that I'm a mum of 4. So it's part of my entanglement. It's certainly very much entangled with my values and particularly in relation to prison education and considering how we can make a difference for future generations as well. So I think it's just another part of me that's important to include there as well. These are the my research questions that I'm currently focusing on in my doctorate. So I am exploring, as Nicole mentioned, the effect of the prison environment, particularly for prison teachers. So a lot of my research was based within one particular male prison, but having experienced other prisons, I know that there's similar affective intensities, not just, of course, for teachers, but for anybody entering that space. And I recognised quite early on that there needed to be a different approach to researching prison education. So at the moment, prison education is in a pretty dire state, largely impacted by perhaps wider political stance around prisons. But that complexity means that then there should also be complexity with the research approach. So using standardized approaches, whether that be quantitative or qualitative approaches, just won't perhaps understand the complexity of the environment and the affectivities that I was trying to understand better. So I have utilised a variety of different methodologies, which I'll talk through today. And really, that's part of this thinking with. So the idea is that the creative methodologies that I'm utilising are thinking with me. I am thinking with them. They are enabling my thinking and the process to hopefully allow us to see prison education in a different way and to feel prison education in a different way. And hopefully the idea then is to create a model of praxis. I'm not quite there yet at the point of the doctorate, but hopefully by the end of this year, I'll be at a position where I can support those entering the prison environment with the results of my research to think about how we can do things differently. So Nicole also mentioned that I am using post-qualitative inquiry. I won't attempt to explain that in its full entirety in these 20 minutes because I think we might need a couple of days. And hopefully many of you on the call are already aware of post-qualitative approach. But the idea is that unlike, I guess, normative or traditional ways of approaching research, the post-qualitative approach is about the possibilities, so the might or the what might be, the becoming of the research. So really thinking about it as a process of inquiry, and it's difficult to explain, of course, because it is centred on uniqueness. So as Saint-Pierre says here, each research approach in post-qualitative inquiry should be different to the last. And therefore it avoids these binary classifications of what research is or should be. It draws very much from the Deleuze-Guattarian writing and thinking. It very much is about this idea of mapping rather than tracing, so creating something new and trying something different. And as I've said, there's no kind of one size fits all approach here. It is this concept of a thousand tiny, sorry, I've noted the typo there, but a thousand tiny methodologies, as Patty Lather says about it. I also draw as well on different creative methodologies. So things like orthography, bringing together teaching and art and philosophy as well as research creation from the likes of Manning and Masumi. And of course, practice as research. So recognizing that my research is not just necessarily about the end product, about the participants or even about the space that I'm researching, but is in my own experiences are integral to that and entangled within that. And I can't separate myself out from that. And of course, with having a textiles background, bringing my textiles into the research has been both refreshing because I've been able to be, I guess, comfortable with the methodology. But as I mentioned before, it's also been difficult as well. And I'll come talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So these are the different ways that I've used creative methods in my research methodology. So I have undertaken walking interviews rather than interviews, so drawing on Barad and Haraway there, connecting kind of that philosophy into the process as well. So the walking interviews were with the teacher participants in the prison space. So we walked around the prison grounds, and during that walking, we also collected objects. So if there were any kind of ephemera as we were walking, we'd collect that and put it in our pockets, which had quite an unusual effect on me, almost like I was stealing something from the prison. But it was things like feathers or twigs or flowers. And then we also did drawing as part of the interview. And whilst I don't talk about that a lot in today's presentation, I found the drawing, the pausing to draw, enabled the participants to talk much more freely. So as they were drawing, a lot of the conversation, well, I wasn't asking them any questions during this time, but it was giving them a lot of headspace to be able to process some of the earlier questions that I'd asked them. And they started to talk quite freely and much more openly than they had done during the actual walking. So that was just an interesting point I wanted to make. I then also conducted a visual matrix. So the same participants were involved in an online session. This is where we took the drawings and the collected objects and we used them as opportunities really to discuss through some of the questions again and some of the complexity around prison education, and we'd use the images as prompts to talk about that. So I'll show you some examples of some of those images in a moment as well. And then my analysis of both of those processes has been what I call a diffractive approach, again, drawing on the philosophies. I have been weaving and stitching with the participants' recordings of the walking interviews, listening to them, walking with them as well. So I found the pace of walking whilst listening kind of matches the pace of the original walking interview, and as that has unlocked some of my thinking, and the repetitive nature of the weaving and the stitching as well kind of aligns with the walking. So that again has really helped with my thinking in the analysis. So before I show you some images of the kind of collected objects and some of my stitching and the drawings and so on, I wanted to just make a point about the materiality of those. So I think for me, it's been a big aspect of my research methodology, is the materiality of feeling the participants' experiences as much as kind of hearing them in the recordings of the transcripts. So the holding of the weaving, the holding of the drawings has that material power that Bennett talks about when she mentions thing power. So I think it's very much entangled in everything that I'm talking about, and I don't quite know how it will manifest in the end product or whatever that might be, or if we're going from a post-qualitative stance, it will be ongoing, there won't be an end product. It will keep becoming every time it interacts with something new. But I feel like it needs to have an acknowledgement before I go on any further to these kind of non-human entities and the vital role that they play in this research. So for me, it was very much about the material space of the prison, but also some of the material objects in there as well, both kind of non-human objects such as the flowers, but also things like the documents that we were working with as teachers as well. So this aerial photograph was perhaps the first thing that prompted my creativity as part of my research. So when I first entered into the prison, I obviously was trying to kind of find my way around and to feel familiar with the space. And I was visiting lots of the different wings to get to know people, and also to visit different prisoners as well who were students with us. And the prison education space was right in the centre of the prison. So on the aerial map that you can see, it's one of those central buildings. And it was probably about a week after I'd worked there that I was just interested in kind of understanding the layout of the prison from an aerial perspective. So I Googled the map, and I really was almost obsessed, I guess, with this aerial view of the prison. And so I started to stitch with my experiences. So every day I would record some of the walking that I'd done that day with my stitching, and over the kind of weeks that got quite entangled and messy because I was here, there and everywhere, and it was very much an activity that I was just doing at the end of the day. So it's layered with that experience of almost feeling lost in the prison, not quite understanding, having spatial awareness when first entering the prison. It's layered with kind of the complexity of getting in and out of the gates. So there are a multitude of gates that you must open and close every time you want to go somewhere. And of course, it's not an easy task then to just nip to a particular, go and speak to somebody. You know, it's a process of having to lock and unlock gates, and the security aspect and sometimes fear around that. Also, some of the hidden kind of complexity around things like what the different wings were for. So, of course, there would be a wing there for vulnerable prisoners, where the likes of rapists were incarcerated. So some of the entanglement is around the feelings that I felt about entering those particular wings in comparison to others. So the stitching, therefore, represents a multitude of different feelings, affects, experiences for me. And it was the first kind of way that I'd brought textiles into my research. And at the time, actually, I didn't even realize it was anything to do with my research. It was just a personal little project, but it's since become a really nice representation of how textiles can embody, I guess, that experience. And what I then asked participants to do before we did the walking interviews, I asked them to map the route that they wanted to take me on the walking interview. So that was partly to enable a better power balance, so that they felt that they had some control over that walking interview, and partly from a security aspect. I needed to make sure that they weren't asking to take me anywhere that we weren't allowed to go. So I've got now a collection of these maps of where their drawings were. And interestingly, the one on the left is one of the participants' drawings, and they've completely avoided the vulnerable prisoners wing. So although they've gone right around the rest of the prison, they've completely avoided that. And that led to some interesting conversation in the interview. Okay, so these were some of the drawings that were done during the actual walking interview. So we had birds of prey in the prison, and quite often when I asked participants what they'd like to draw, they were drawn to the birds of prey, and we'd sit and look at the birds of prey and draw those. So this is just an example of some of the participants' drawings from that. And here are some examples from my analysis as well. So these are the weavings that I would do whilst I've been listening to the transcripts. So bringing in kind of some of the pause moments for me when I've stopped and had to re-listen, or sometimes if it's making me feel uncomfortable, I've tried to represent that with the knottiness. I've included this idea of entanglement, so there's some rhizomatic plants being woven into the weaving as well. Then this one in particular represents, I guess, more kind of explicitly some of the things that have come out of the conversations with participants. So one thing I noticed in the interviews was that all the participants were referring to prisoners as lads. And of course, kind of drawing on the work of Foucault and post-structuralism, I looked at the etymology of the word lads, and it actually derives from an old word for socks, and kind of this notion that almost like a servant, so somebody who would do something for you. And anyway, this is brought together from some old socks. So the material is old socks that have been pulled apart and then woven back together. And it was just interesting to kind of play with that idea and allow the thinking to come through in the weaving. And again, this one representing kind of those different experiences in the prison, so the dark and the light, and the use of kind of different affects from the buildings that were mentioned in the interviews. I also had an opportunity really for myself to use Stitch to help me with the method, with the philosophies as well. So when I was trying to think about my theoretical framework and I was really stuck with what that was, I don't think I've come out of that stuckness yet. I'm still right in the middle of it. And it felt really messy. And so I wanted to kind of stitch with it, that my instinct is to stitch or to weave or to use some kind of textiles. So to help me come out of that entanglement and that messiness, I started to stitch with it. And I'm almost kind of embarrassed by this piece because it's quite ugly, but I also love it at the same time because of that messiness. So I love that it kind of represents how I was feeling at the time, the knots of and complexity of that, those theoretical frameworks, that it shouldn't be easy. It is complex, and certainly with post-qualitative inquiry, it draws from so many different ontologies that it's never going to be something that's easily explained. So yeah, kind of just drawing a little bit more on the theme of knots, and that kind of process of using the practice to help me through the research. I made some notes around how I was feeling at the time when I was creating that textiles piece. And one of the things that kind of manifested for me was this idea that that there were things in there that I wasn't quite expecting, that the knots were appearing and then disappearing, and that actually the end conclusion after creating this mess was that it's okay for it to be messy, and that it allowed me some ease, I guess. So in having that discomfort and manifesting it in this material way, it allowed me to have some acceptance about the fact that it is messy, and that's absolutely fine. That's the process that I've chosen to work with, and that I should embrace that rather than trying to resist it. Yeah, I don't know whether my supervisors agree with that, but that's where I'm at with it. So yeah, kind of on that problem of creativity, I think one of the things that I've discussed quite a lot with my supervisors is this idea that perhaps that the creativity is quite self-indulgent. So I had a real problem with me thinking, oh, I'm just really loving doing this weaving and this stitching and it's such fun, but oh yeah, I should really be writing something about how I'm going to help these participants and these teachers in prison education. And what my supervisors have done really nicely is they've allowed me to play and allowed me to express myself in that way, in recognition that actually that will help with the process of finding something different within the research and finding some new approaches that we can help the participants with, and ultimately allowing the participants as well to express themselves more freely. So it's enabled me to kind of push against what we might see as academic norms and kind of this traditional form of research communication, but equally kind of also finding ways of communicating this, but also, I guess, allowing me to have that enjoyment of the process at the same time. So I think the inquiry itself isn't all about the creativity. Of course, it isn't. There's a very serious inquiry that I'm making into prison education, but it's allowed me to enjoy it a lot more through the process, and hopefully the process has enabled different perspectives to come through in comparison to me perhaps using what's classed as normative approaches. But as I say, this has been filled with discomfort. So there's definitely joy in being creative, but there's been a lot of angst for me and fear in sharing this, especially because I'm working with political bodies such as the prison service. So they have expected me to take quite a standard approach, and I had to push back and say, well, actually, this will enable us to see this from a different perspective, because the previous ways you've researched this hasn't led to anything useful. And in fairness, when I've approached HMPPS, the prison service, they've been quite open to this approach and enabled me to do the research. So I think there's something to be said about staying with the trouble here and pushing against it and almost using it as a way of activism against some of those standard approaches. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into what I've been doing. As I said, I can't fully explain it all in 20 minutes. It's not possible, but hopefully it's given you a little bit of a hint to what I'm doing. And I'd really love to answer any questions or have any discussions that anyone wants to bring forward.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you. I'm giving you a round of applause so you can hear me, but there's a virtual round of applause as well. People are clapping virtually. So thank you very, very much for your presentation. I really, really appreciate that. I obviously do have some questions, but I want to give everybody an opportunity to also raise any questions or add any comments, either in the chat function or let yourself be known to me, and I'll bring you in and you can unmute yourself and share your video, and you can ask Lucy directly yourself. Lucy, may I ask you, could you stop sharing the screen so we can see a little bit more of you now? Thank you very much. So until other people are diving in with their questions, I obviously take the opportunity to kick off the conversation myself. I always like doing that because it feels like people are quite shy at first, but then I have plenty of questions anyway. I quite happily hold the conversation with you for the next 20 minutes as well, if need be. So the first question I've got, I really appreciate how you've talked about some of the challenges of the kind of work that you're doing. You're talking about how practice as research, as I understand it, in that scheme of things, is a different way of generating knowledge. And at the same time, you know, there are people that are receptive to it. They understand this generally helps with generating new knowledge. But at the same time, kind of, well, but it's not traditional, so I'm not sure I like it. So it's kind of, I understand it, I like it, but yeah, no, I don't like it. And it's that kind of attitude that people bring to it. How do you sit with that in terms of your own work? Do you end up, in a way, trying to play a game of compliance and you know, try to comply with certain rules and regulations? Because ultimately, I mean, this is your doctoral research, so ultimately you want that doctorate at the end of it. Or is it that you're pushing your boundaries so far that you're kind of working on that, you know, working on that front, and just think to yourself, well, I'm ignoring every, you know, advice on compliance, and I just do what I think I need to do. How do you deal with that on a personal level?
I think there's a couple of things there. I think that a lot of what we're doing is justified. There's lots of people who have done this work before us, you know, whether that's from Indigenous ontologies or kind of post-qualitative inquiry, or, you know, just more creative qualitative inquiry. I think that there's a blueprint there that's gone before us. So if we can justify it in that way and underpin our conversations, you know, particularly for me in the thesis, by those who have done this before, or kind of theoretical concepts that are grounded in that philosophy as well. So particularly Deleuze and Guattari, you can kind of pretty much get away with anything. Then you've kind of supported that argument and justification for using those methodologies. I think in terms of kind of academic conventions and pushing the boundaries there, I think this is something that I'm writing with my supervisors with at the moment. So I think what's interesting is that perhaps a lot of the boundaries that we perceive are only perceptions of boundaries. They're not actually there. So I think when you push against them and perhaps say, well, I'd really like to do this, most of the time they're open to that. I think it's only that we think that these kind of conventions will restrict us. And of course, you know, there are some things that we can't get away with, but quite often there are other things that if you ask and if you try and if you just push a little bit, you'll find that actually most supervisors or academia in general will be open to that creativity, and embrace it, I guess.
Thank you. And I think the fact that the two of us met at the International Conference for Creative Methods is a way of kind of showing that there is quite a lot of traction in that field. I mean, that conference was particularly successful and incredibly busy, with loads of people wanting to be there and not being able to because there was, it was sold out really early on. I think that kind of goes to show that actually a lot of us are working in those kinds of spaces recognize that the benefits, even if sometimes perhaps the pushback in other areas is a little bit tough. So there are a couple of questions that I am going to raise on behalf of other people. So one of the questions in the chat box was, I'm wondering if and how you memo as you are doing your stitching to help you to be able to explain it to your audience. So for example, do you shift back and forth between taking notes and working with the textiles, or do you reflect about that afterwards?
I probably take different approaches each time. It depends on kind of what zone I'm in, I guess. I think when I first started doing the weaving, I felt like I needed to document everything. So I'd kind of do a row and then I'd write something down, and then I'd do a row and I'd write something down, and it kind of disrupted the flow a little bit. Yes. So the next time I went to do it, I kind of instead went for a more fluid approach and just allowed the weaving to happen, and then recorded afterwards. I have also kind of utilized my phone for voice memos as I've been weaving, so I've recorded it that way, but I don't kind of have a particular way of doing things. I almost I'm always experimenting, I guess. So I guess I'm still, whatever way I'm doing things, I'm always kind of going, oh, I don't know whether I want to do it the same as last time, because I'd like to try something new. So yeah, I don't think I have a fixed approach. I also find that I kind of come back to these pieces later and allow the material, fabric, the threads to talk to me again at a later date. So I'll quite often hide them away, not look at them. Similar, I guess, to the way that you might edit a document. If you come back to it with fresh eyes, you'll see and feel something different. So I tend to do that. I kind of put them away, lock them away in a cupboard, and then I'll come back to them and feel them and go, oh yeah, actually that made me feel like this. Or this has unlocked a new process of thought here. So yeah, there's no one particular way I approach it.
Thank you. I think I'm that kind of resonates with me as well, that a lot of the times you kind of let the material speak to you, and the material talks to you as well as you are talking to the materials as well. So I can totally relate to that. There's a comment there that I like to bring in here, which says, the creativity sounds wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I feel inspired. So I just thought I need to share that straight away. There's the other thing that I was going to kind of hook onto with that question about explaining it to your audience. Do you feel that you actually have to explain them to your audience? I mean, obviously in a presentation like this, you're having to, because you're having to talk about it. But otherwise, do you think that it would be good enough, or okay to just like let the pieces speak for themselves without an explanation?
That's something I'm really battling with, actually, because for me the piece is enough. Like I shouldn't have to explain. Like I know that, like, just look at the piece and it should tell you everything, but of course it doesn't, because it's all in my head. So particularly for the thesis, I've had to do some explanation of what that means, but I also don't want to give too much away. I also, particularly in post-qualitative inquiry, there's an appreciation that the way that you look at that piece will be very different to the way that I look at that piece, and it will unlock different thinking for you than it does for me. So yes, I've had to explain some of the thinking behind the pieces, and again, justify its presence in the research and in the thesis. But at the same time, I like to kind of leave some room for people to interact with it themselves and to take their own interpretations from it. And then that was part of the visual matrix, actually, was that I shared some of the weaving as part of that visual matrix and allowed the participants to engage with it, but I didn't tell them any of my own personal kind of meanings behind it. I just allowed them to take it as they saw it. So I think there's a bit of both kind of there.
It's interesting because I'm grappling with that same topic at the moment. I have shared one of my poetic inquiry pieces with a group of poets, and the comments were, well, you know, this is not you know, the kind of poem that we would usually read. It doesn't have any flowery language or, you know, like breezy images. It was quite factual. But in many ways, it was meant to be factual because I wanted the piece to stand for itself so that I wouldn't have to explain it. Whereas if you use breezy vocabulary and breezy flowery images, and, you know, people may misunderstand the metaphor. So I kept it quite tight, thinking then it can stand on its own. And that was interesting to see the reaction that actually, even then, it can't fully stand on its own either. So it's a really complex, you know, sort of issue that we encounter in that kind of space.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on who the audience is and what the
Yes.
context is. You know, in some,
Yes.
you know, if it was a fine art gallery, you could have the pieces on their own and they would stand for themselves and allow for that interpretation to happen. But as it's a thesis, then I have to justify it.
Well, actually, this is kind of tying in quite nicely with the next question. Somebody says here, I felt such comfort hearing about your research journey and that it's not a linear process when using post-qualitative inquiry. How far are you through your research? So you know, that's essentially the question on this one.
So I'm in my 4th year part-time. So I am also working full-time, and as I said, have children as well, and a little bit of a social life. So I'm aiming to submit at the end of this year. That's the plan.
Which is super fast for a part-timer.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if that doesn't happen and it's a year after, then that's absolutely fine. But I'm in the write-up phase, so I finished all the what you would call data collection if it wasn't post-qualitative inquiry, and I'm writing up at the moment with an aim to have the thesis finished by the end of this year.
Congratulations already. I mean, this is a massive achievement already, so well done. A comment here. I have really enjoyed hearing about your work. I'm in the midst of narrative inquiry in my PhD research, and I see alignments in pulling at threads. I'm encouraged by the post-qualitative work that you are doing, very inspiring. So I just thought I'd share that. And if it's okay, I would like to bring in now a person who's wanting to ask you a question as well. Caroline, I'm kind of missing you now. Yeah, here you are. Thank you. Please shoot.
Hi, hello. Yeah, interestingly, I'm in the same boat. I'm in 4th year part-time PhD and trying as well to say that I'll finish it this year, but allow myself the caveat that I might not. But so it's good to hear from somebody else that's also trying to juggle lots of different things. So I guess I was interested in one of the problems, or one of the tensions, I suppose, that I'm finding is that you know, the idea that the PhD is the creation, or the thesis is the creation of new knowledge, versus what you said at the beginning, which is the kind of acknowledgement, or even more than an acknowledgement. The research is an ongoing process. So I think you use the word, you know, it's a becoming, it's not a conclusion. And I guess it's just that this is something I'm also grappling with myself in terms of presenting that in the thesis, and how you actually, you know, have you found a way to address that yourself, or is that something, how are you managing to balance those two kind of almost opposite ideas, I suppose?
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? And I know I don't have an answer, I'm sorry. But yeah, I think it's something that, you know, my third question is that I'm going to develop a praxis, or, you know, aid practitioners in prison education to develop their own praxis through the knowledge that's been acquired through this inquiry. But that then it seems really finite, that's then an end conclusion. And I think we do need to compartmentalize almost, you know, the thesis is one thing and it has a purpose to get us the doctorate. And so we will have to, I've been talking about this with colleagues and friends this morning, that you have to play the game. You have to go, okay, well, this is the information that you need for the thesis, and I'm going to come up with some conclusions. However, that's not the end. You know, we will continue this research, and I'm sure, you know, for anybody who's spent any amount of time as we do on doing a doctorate, it's not just going to stop once we've got that doctorate. You know, we will want to continue to write papers, to continue exploring that theme, to look at it from different angles. So yes, there's a finite end product in terms of the thesis and whatever outcomes appear from that. But I think what I will be saying in that conclusion of the thesis is that, and certainly for the development of the praxis that I want to help prison teachers develop, is that won't be a finite product. That will be something that will always be in becoming, because it will change as kind of policy changes. It will change as new teachers come into the fold. It will change, you know, as new ideas come through. So we can only ever come up with a conclusion for that moment, and actually it will always be altering. And that's the premise of post-qualitative inquiry, is that it's you know, we can't just take this and say this is not attached to everything else. It's entangled, and it's and it always will be developing and changing. So we can't pretend to just give the knowledge for that piece of information, because somebody else comes along and engages with it, and that knowledge changes. So yeah, I think I haven't found the solution yet, I'm sorry, but it's really nice
that's a good
you're also
solution.
battling with that.
Thank you.
I think, if I may jump into that conversation, as somebody who's supervising and examining PhDs now, I think the trick is also to know your examiner. So as you are writing up and you're in that stage now where you are, you know, like generally looking towards the end, generally have a look at whose work is it that you admire and who you would like to be your examiner. And then choose an examiner that allows you to be different. So in my own PhD, I had a fictionalization in there. I had a whole chapter which was just short stories essentially, and I knew that I would have to choose an examiner who would be amenable to that. And that's something that you have to negotiate with your supervisors, but generally look at whose work is it that you are, you know, like following, that you're looking to, that you're quoting. Those are usually good indicators for people that you may want to ask to be your examiners. And just to say, I know that usually the rule is that you have to have an internal and an external examiner. There is room. So if on the internal front, you really haven't got anybody in your institution that is appropriate, because what you do is so far out of what everybody else does in your institution, there are opportunities for you to ask for two externals. It's not very common. They usually want people, you know, like one internal, one external, but this is not like a hard, fast rule that cannot be broken or bent or moved. So don't get too hung up about those kinds of things. Generally look to, you know, who is it that would be a good examiner? Who would you like to have as a conversationalist for your PhD exam? Because that's what it is. You know, who would you like to have an informed conversation with about your work? And that will then help you sort of look towards you know, like meaningful examiners. And in your case, Lucy, I would suggest that one of them would be from prison education and the other one would be a methodologist. And there you go. You then have that space to actually do the things that are weird and wonderful that the prison educationalist may not love. But, you know, the methodologist will actually be saying, you know what, this is a good way of going, and this is really interesting, and this is why this is perfect. So don't get too hung up about how do I present it in the traditional form. Present it to who is your examiner. That is the key of how you kind of look at it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually been quite freeing for me, because on the back actually of the Creative Research Methods conference, Pam Bernard approached me and asked if I had my external examiner yet. And so she is now going to be my external examiner, which has been really freeing for me to know that actually with her approach and her ability to be able to be open to creative methodologies, that I can be a little bit more of myself.
Exactly.
Research. So yeah, I would agree completely.
There's a comment in the chat box, actually. I have to have 2 externals for my PhD because I'm staff and student at the same institution. There will always be, there will always be people having 2 externals at all institutions. So yes, absolutely. To going back to that comment, it's a conversation rather rather than a defense. Obviously, we do call it a defense because you're having to defend your methods, you're having to defend your thinking, you're having to defend your concept. But ultimately, it's an informed conversation with people that are reading your thesis in detail, and you don't get many opportunities. Because how many people? I mean, apart from my supervisors and my examiners, I don't think even my husband and my son read part of it. So, honestly, nobody reads it. So it's the kind of things that you're publishing that those get read, but the actual thesis only gets read by your examiners and your supervisors. So it would be very good to select somebody that you want to have a meaningful conversation with about that. There's a question, sorry, Lucy, going back to you. There's a question. I'm a 2nd year full-time PhD in fine art, but post-disciplinary with geography. Will you exhibit your creative portfolio? And if not, could that be a becoming rather than your conclusion?
Yeah, I haven't really thought about that, to be honest. I guess because I've had this battle within myself about it being this self-indulgent process of, working through the research through textiles, I was kind of taking the emphasis away from the creative methodologies to forefront the participants' experiences. And so for the time being, I don't know whether I'd do that as part of the research, but that said, maybe post-doctorate, that might be something that I consider doing. And I've certainly, I've been a participant with other people's research where that's happened, and that's been really lovely, and I've really valued that work kind of being displayed, although my anonymity was kept. It was nice to be out there in that kind of sphere, but I don't know whether my participants would agree. And so I can see there's another kind of question there around ethical approval. And
yes.
So I guess it would be easy for me to present my own work because it's so kind of, as we said before, the interpretation isn't really obvious. It's unless I explained it. But I guess for some of the participant drawings, the ethical approval doesn't include for that to be publicly displayed in an exhibition in that way. So it would probably be difficult. But yeah, I think my own work would be fine to do that.
Can I just say, Lucy, you were saying about, the ethical approval for the drawings as compared to, interview transcripts and etc. I would like to point out that when we are reporting findings, we often select, an interview transcript, an excerpt of an interview transcript, and we share that as a statement. I always say to ethics committees and anyone, PhD supervisees, etc., that ultimately the drawings, as far as I can see them, are no different from the interview transcript. So if we are allowing the interview transcript to be publicly shared, then why should we not allow the drawings to be shared? So I would suggest that actually, because all of that is the participants' ownership and owned space and owned content and intellectual property, if you like, you would have to negotiate with the participants whether they are happy for that to be going out there. But as long as they are, I can't see any ethical issues. The only ethical issues I could see is if through the drawings, individual people would be recognizable. But that's, again, the same as in the interview transcripts, where you are choosing a part that is then de-anonymized in such a way that you can't trace it back to a particular participant.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and definitely something that I mean, this is what these things are for, isn't it? To, again, kind of unlock that
Exactly,
thinking.
yes.
But yeah, I'm leaving here with lots of different ideas. That's wonderful. Thank you.
That's all right. There's one more question. I'm trying to articulate a question for you, but I'm struggling a little. Just thinking about my own experience of the contrast between prison world and outside world, and wondering whether the weaving is a way of pausing, processing, reflecting for you that creates a threshold that manages that violence and contrast. Is this something you aim to do with your practice resources developed for teachers? Develop tools to enable them to manage the contrast?
Yeah, I think that's really the first point there. Absolutely. And I've written about this in my thesis, is that it's definitely kind of a softening of the experience for me. And working in the prison was hard, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. You know, it was difficult, and I did struggle a lot with that kind of moral distress, I guess, around that. And so the use of the weaving and the stitching does help me to soften that experience. Whether it would do the same for participants, I'm not sure, but certainly, yeah, I think that that's a nice kind of way into it that you've explained there, that kind of idea that the practice or whatever that is created to support perhaps teachers going into prison education, but also current prison teachers as well. It should be a way for them to, like you've said, soften the experience, or I don't know whether I've kind of interpreted that my own way, but yeah, to create this threshold, and to acknowledge it, even, because actually I think that's part of the problem, is that it's not even acknowledged. It's kind of taken that you will just be a teacher in the prison and you'll be a teacher like you would be anywhere else, when of course there's so much complexity around that that isn't acknowledged. So if there was some greater acknowledgement of that, I think that would help them to process that better, and hopefully would help them in terms of their longevity in the career, and also their, I guess, their autonomy to be able to manage it for themselves as well, and speak up, I guess. So yeah, I think there's again, I haven't got the answers yet. Hopefully by the end of this year I will, but I'm not quite sure how that's going to kind of work its way out. But it might involve kind of that same idea of a threshold. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. There's one comment. This was so helpful, such a rich conversation and discussion. Thank you so much. So I would like to say thank you very, very much. I'm quite aware of the time, making sure that everybody can leave before 3 o'clock. So there's again a load of thank yous coming in, and congratulations and well wishes for your project. I'm just going to very quickly share some details of the Practices Research Network. You can subscribe to the recordings. You can connect with the Practices Research website. You can obviously contact me as well. I have put the links in the chat box as well, so please do connect with me through that. Again, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this, Lucy. I really, really appreciate that. And I look forward to hear more of your projects in the future.
Thanks, everybody.